The conductor had seen many strange things over the years: forgotten luggage, sleepless passengers, the quiet unease of late-night journeys. But never before had he opened the door to a compartment and felt his blood run cold. A man was found dead in a train at the final station, seated quietly in a compartment the conductor was certain had remained empty for the entire journey. There was no ticket on him, no sign of struggle, and not a single passenger could recall seeing him board. Stranger still, the window of the compartment was locked from the inside. Tonight, you will once again step into the world of Detective Blackwood, where even the smallest detail may shift the truth. What began as a simple curiosity soon unfolded into one of his most perplexing cases, a mystery shaped not only by what was discovered, but by what had gone unnoticed. I remember the morning the case first reached us with a quiet clarity that seemed almost deliberate, as though the city itself had chosen the hour carefully. London had not yet fully awakened, and the pale light of early day moved slowly along the streets, softening edges and muting sound. It was at that hour that a note arrived for Edmund Blackwood, delivered by hand, carrying with it a detail so unusual that it seemed, even before it was read, to belong to something outside the ordinary rhythm of events. The conductor, according to the note, had spent many years on the railway and had grown accustomed to the small peculiarities of travel: forgotten belongings, restless passengers, the subtle unease that often settled over late-night journeys. Yet never before had he opened the door to a compartment and felt something within him falter, as though what he saw could not be reconciled with what he knew to be possible. A man had been found dead in a train at the final station, seated quietly in a compartment that, by all accounts, had remained empty for the entire journey. There was no ticket on him, no sign of disturbance within the confined space, and not a single passenger could recall seeing him enter the carriage. The window of the compartment, carefully checked earlier that night, had been closed and secured from the inside. By the time I joined Edmund, he had already read the note more than once, though there was nothing in his manner to suggest urgency. Instead, there was a certain stillness about him, the kind that appeared when a matter was not merely unusual, but carried with it a deeper inconsistency that could not be easily dismissed. It was in such moments that I understood my role most clearly, not as one who would lead the inquiry, but as one who would observe it, record it, and attempt, in time, to make sense of the quiet logic that guided his thoughts. We made our way to the station without haste, moving through streets that had only just begun to gather their usual momentum. There was a calmness to London at that hour, a brief interval in which the city seemed to exist between states, neither fully at rest nor entirely awake. Edmund walked with measured steps, his attention not fixed on any one point, but dispersed, as though he were already assembling fragments of a pattern not yet visible. The station itself carried the subdued rhythm of early activity. Steam lingered in the air in thin, fading traces, and the sounds of movement were steady but restrained, as though even the machinery of the railway had not yet reached its full voice. Nothing in the scene suggested disruption, yet there remained an undercurrent that was difficult to define, a sense that something had occurred which did not belong to the usual order of things. The conductor stood waiting near the end of the platform, his posture composed, though not entirely at ease. His account, given with care and precision, revealed a routine so familiar that any deviation from it could not have gone unnoticed. He had inspected the carriage shortly after departure and had found the compartment entirely unoccupied, with no luggage or personal effects to suggest use. One detail remained particularly clear in his recollection. The window had been slightly open, and he had closed it himself, ensuring it was properly secured. From that point onward, nothing had occurred that might have drawn attention to the compartment. The journey had continued without interruption, and no passenger had reported anything unusual. It was only upon arrival, during the final inspection, that the door had been opened once more and the man discovered within, seated as though he had occupied the space for the entire duration of the trip. Edmund Blackwood received this account without interruption, though it was evident that each detail was being carefully considered, not in isolation, but in relation to the others. It was not the presence of the man that seemed to hold his attention most firmly, but rather the absence of any indication that he had arrived in a conventional manner. When we entered the carriage, the contrast between the quiet order of the platform and the enclosed stillness within was immediately apparent. The corridors stretched ahead in uniform repetition, each compartment indistinguishable from the next, and yet one carried a subtle distinction that could not be attributed to appearance alone. Edmund moved along the passage with a quiet certainty, stopping at a door without hesitation. The compartment itself was undisturbed. The man sat by the window in a composed position, his posture neither rigid nor collapsed, but held in a way that suggested an absence of movement rather than the presence of struggle. His clothing bore no sign of damage, and there were no visible marks upon him that might immediately suggest the cause of death. The surrounding space remained orderly, the seat opposite untouched, the surfaces free from disruption. What drew attention most persistently was not any single detail, but the consistency of the scene. Everything appeared as it should, and it was precisely this absence of irregularity that gave rise to unease. The window remained secured from within, the door showed no evidence of forced entry, and the confined space offered no clear explanation of how the man had entered. As I stood within that quiet compartment, it became difficult to reconcile the simplicity of what was seen with the complexity of what it implied. A man had been found where no man had been, had occupied a space without altering it, and had remained within a sealed environment that allowed for no clear explanation of entry. It was then that I understood what had unsettled Blackwood from the very beginning. The case did not present itself as a question of death alone, but as something more elusive, something that existed between events rather than within them. The problem was not the presence of the man, but the absence of his arrival. I remained with Edmund Blackwood in the compartment longer than I had expected, not because there was much to see at first glance, but because there was so little to disturb the eye. The stillness of the space did not suggest neglect, nor did it carry the faint disorder that usually follows even the briefest human presence. Instead, it held a kind of quiet completeness, as though everything within it had settled into place long before we arrived, leaving nothing that immediately demanded attention. It was this absence of urgency that seemed to guide Edmund's movements. He did not approach the matter as one might approach a scene of violence, searching for disruption or obvious trace, but rather as something that required patience, a gradual understanding built from details too subtle to present themselves all at once. His gaze moved across the compartment with measured care, pausing where the fabric of the seat met the polished wood, where light fell unevenly across the narrow space, where the faintest suggestion of use might reveal itself under closer inspection. From my position near the door, I began to observe the same details, though without the certainty that seemed to shape his attention. The man's posture remained the most striking element. There was no tension in the way he sat, no sign that his final moments had been marked by struggle or alarm. His hands rested naturally, his clothing lay undisturbed, and even the slight angle of his head suggested stillness rather than collapse. It was the appearance of someone who had come to rest, not someone who had been overcome. And yet, there was no indication that rest had been intended. The absence of a ticket, which at first might have seemed a minor irregularity, now took on a greater significance. In a system governed by routine and careful record, such an omission was not easily overlooked. Every passenger who entered the train left some trace of that entry, whether through the exchange of a ticket, the notice of a conductor, or the simple awareness of those nearby. Here, there was nothing of the sort. The man had no visible connection to the journey he had somehow completed. Edmund's attention shifted toward the floor, where the narrow strip of carpet ran unbroken from one side of the compartment to the other. There were marks upon it, though none that stood apart from what might be expected in a space that had seen regular use. Still, he studied them with a focus that suggested they held some quiet importance, as though even the most ordinary impressions might reveal something when considered in relation to what was missing. I followed his line of observation and began to notice a subtle inconsistency. The dust that had settled along the edges of the compartment, where cleaning tools rarely reached, remained undisturbed in most places, forming a thin, even layer that spoke of time passing without interruption. Yet near the lower edge of the window frame, there was the faintest suggestion of disruption, not a clear mark, but a slight unevenness, as though something had brushed against it without leaving a defined trace. It was not enough, on its own, to suggest a conclusion. In another setting, it might have gone entirely unnoticed. But within a space that offered so few irregularities, even this small variation seemed to carry weight. Edmund did not remark upon it directly, yet his attention lingered there a moment longer than elsewhere, and that alone was enough to fix it in my mind. It was often the case that he would allow a detail to remain unspoken, not out of uncertainty, but because its meaning had not yet fully emerged. He preferred to let such observations settle, to return to them only when they could be understood in the context of a larger pattern. The window itself remained a point of quiet interest. Its position, its frame, the mechanism by which it was secured, all appeared intact, unchanged from the time it had been closed earlier in the journey. There was no visible damage, no sign that force had been applied. And yet, the presence of the man within the compartment suggested that the boundary it represented had, at some point, been crossed. I found myself considering the movement of the train, the steady progression through darkness and light, the brief passages between stations where the outside world passed unnoticed by those within. It was during such intervals, I thought, that something might occur without attracting attention, provided it aligned closely enough with the rhythm of the journey. The notion did not yet take form as a conclusion, but it introduced a possibility that had not been present before, that the answer to the question of arrival might not lie within the station, nor within the carriage itself, but somewhere along the route between them. Edmund Blackwood stepped back slightly, allowing the compartment to settle once more into its quiet arrangement. There was no sense of completion in his manner, no indication that the matter had been resolved, yet neither was there uncertainty. Instead, there was a gradual alignment of thought, as though each observation had begun to take its place within a structure not yet fully revealed. As we left the compartment, I carried with me the impression that the case had already begun to shift. What had first appeared as an impossible presence now suggested a carefully concealed movement, something that had occurred not in defiance of reason, but in quiet accordance with it, hidden within the ordinary flow of events. The man had not simply appeared. He had been brought there. And whatever had allowed that to happen had done so without disturbing the order of the journey, leaving behind only the faintest indication that anything had passed between the outside and the sealed stillness within. The early assumptions surrounding the case began to settle into a quiet pattern, though not one that offered clarity. Instead, each detail seemed to confirm the same unsettling conclusion. Nothing within the compartment suggested how the man had arrived, and nothing along the route provided an obvious answer. It was not the absence of information that made the matter difficult, but the consistency of what was already known. Edmund Blackwood directed his attention beyond the carriage soon after, as though the solution did not lie within the sealed space itself, but somewhere along the path the train had taken. The route, though familiar to those who worked it daily, revealed a number of subtle variations when considered with care. There were stretches where the train slowed, not enough to be considered a stop, but sufficient to alter the rhythm of its movement. There were sections where the track curved close to structures built long before the railway had become as regulated as it now was, leaving narrow gaps between passing carriages and the outer walls of forgotten buildings. It was within these intervals that Edmund seemed to find the first trace of direction. The records of the journey confirmed that no scheduled stops had been made between departure and arrival, yet they also revealed moments where the train's speed had been reduced. These changes, though routine, were rarely given much thought. They were part of the system, built into its design, accepted without question. And yet, when placed alongside the problem before us, they suggested something that had previously been overlooked. A movement did not require stillness to remain unseen. It required only that it occur within expectation. The idea, once formed, did not resolve the case, but it shifted its center. Attention moved away from the impossibility of entry and toward the conditions that might allow it to pass unnoticed. The question was no longer how a man could appear within a sealed compartment, but how such an appearance could be concealed within the ordinary flow of travel. Further inquiry into the route brought another detail into focus. There existed a section of track bordered closely by an old storage structure, long unused but still standing in near alignment with the railway. Its walls, darkened by time and weather, stood closer to the passing train than was common in newer constructions. The gap between them, though narrow, was not uniform, and in one particular stretch, it was reduced to a distance that allowed little more than a careful reach. Under ordinary circumstances, such proximity would hold little significance. The speed of the train, even when reduced, would render any attempt to interact with it impractical. Yet the conditions of that night had not been ordinary. The presence of dense fog, recorded by multiple sources, had diminished visibility to a degree that blurred the boundary between movement and stillness. Objects at close range could pass without clear form, their presence suggested only by the faintest distortion in the surrounding air. It became increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility that the answer lay within that convergence of factors: reduced speed, close structure, and obscured visibility. Not as an explanation in itself, but as a condition under which something deliberate might occur without immediate notice. The details within the compartment began to take on new meaning when viewed through this lens. The slight disturbance near the window frame, previously uncertain in its significance, now suggested contact, though not of a kind that left obvious trace. The absence of forced entry no longer implied that entry had not occurred, but rather that it had been achieved without the need for force. Edmund Blackwood did not rush to a conclusion. Instead, he allowed each element to remain in place, as though testing whether they could exist together without contradiction. His method was not to impose an explanation, but to observe whether one emerged naturally from the alignment of facts. In doing so, the case began to lose its appearance of impossibility. What had seemed at first to defy reason now appeared to exist just beyond immediate perception, concealed not by complexity, but by precision. The man had not entered the train in the manner expected of a passenger, nor had he appeared without cause. His presence was the result of a deliberate act, one that relied not on force or speed, but on timing and understanding. The absence of witnesses, once the most troubling aspect of the case, now aligned with this possibility. If the act had occurred within a moment already defined by reduced attention, a curve in the track, a shift in speed, the obscuring effect of fog, then it might pass without notice, leaving behind only the result. Still, a question remained, and it carried with it a quiet weight that could not yet be resolved. If the man had been placed within the compartment during the journey, then his death had occurred elsewhere. And whatever had taken place before that moment had been concealed even more carefully than his arrival. The possibility that the man had not died within the train altered the direction of the inquiry in a quiet but decisive way. What had first appeared to be a mystery contained within a single compartment now extended outward, reaching beyond the carriage, beyond the station, and into the city itself. The stillness of the scene no longer suggested isolation, but concealment. Attention turned, with careful deliberation, to the events of that same night elsewhere in London. It was not uncommon for separate incidents to coincide without connection, yet there are moments when timing alone invites consideration. On that particular evening, a jeweler's shop, situated in a district far removed from the railway line, had been the target of a calculated robbery. The details, though not widely circulated, revealed a precision that stood apart from ordinary theft. The entry had been clean, the selection of items deliberate, and the departure swift enough to leave little trace of the perpetrator's presence. More notably, there had been no unnecessary disturbance, no sign of panic or haste. Whoever had carried out the act had done so with preparation and restraint, taking only what could be carried easily and leaving behind no clear indication of identity. Initial reports had suggested the involvement of more than one individual. Subtle variations in the pattern of movement, The positioning of objects and the handling of secured cases pointed toward coordination rather than chance. It was not a crime of impulse, but one shaped by prior agreement. As Edmund considered these details, a connection began to take form, not as a certainty, but as a possibility that could not be ignored. The description provided by a distant observer, vague though it was, aligned in certain respects with the man found in the train. It was not a complete likeness, nor one that could be relied upon without question, but it was sufficient to suggest that the two events might share more than coincidence. The idea introduced a new layer to the case, one that shifted its weight from mystery toward intention. If the man had been involved in the robbery, then his presence in the compartment was no longer an isolated occurrence, but part of a sequence that extended across both time and place. His lack of a ticket, once a detail of curiosity, now appeared consistent with a departure made in haste, without regard for ordinary procedure. Yet this connection, rather than simplifying the matter, deepened it. If 3 individuals had taken part in the robbery, and only one had been found, then the absence of the others demanded explanation. There were no immediate reports of pursuit, no indication that the remaining participants had been apprehended or identified. Their disappearance, like the man's appearance in the train, suggested a movement carried out with care. The condition of the body offered little in the way of direct answers, yet its stillness now carried a different meaning. The lack of struggle, the composed posture, the absence of visible injury, all pointed toward a conclusion that the final moments of the man's life had not occurred in the confined space where he was discovered. Whatever had ended his life had done so elsewhere, under circumstances that allowed for control rather than resistance. This, in turn, raised a question of motive. If the man had been part of a coordinated act, then his death was unlikely to have been the result of chance. It suggested a division, a decision made after the crime had been completed, one that required both opportunity and intent. The presence of 2 unseen individuals, combined with the careful placement of the body, began to outline a pattern that was neither impulsive nor uncertain. Edmund Blackwood approached this possibility with the same measured attention he had given to the compartment itself. He did not assume betrayal, nor did he dismiss it. Instead, he allowed the elements to align gradually, observing whether they could form a structure that remained consistent under scrutiny. The timing of the robbery, the route of the train, the condition of the body, and the absence of witnesses, each detail, when considered alone, offered little. Yet together, they suggested a sequence that moved from action to concealment with deliberate continuity. The man had not simply vanished after the robbery. He had been removed, and in that removal, there was an intention not only to end his life, but to ensure that the circumstances of his death would lead elsewhere, drawing attention away from its origin and toward a place where no clear answer could be found. The train, with its enclosed compartments and predictable movement, had provided the perfect setting for such a design. It allowed for presence without entry, for discovery without explanation, and for a question that would persist long enough to obscure the truth behind it. Yet even within this emerging understanding, something remained incomplete. If the man had been placed within the train after his death, and if his companions had sought to conceal their involvement, then the method by which they had achieved this must have been known to them in advance. It was not the kind of act that could be improvised, nor one that could succeed without careful knowledge of both time and place, which meant that the decision to remove him had likely been made before the robbery had even begun, and that, more than anything else, suggested that the man found in the compartment had never been intended to share in what had been taken. The emerging outline of the case suggested not a sequence of accidents, but a design that had been formed well in advance of the events themselves. The robbery, the disappearance of 2 individuals, and the quiet presence of the third within a sealed compartment all appeared to belong to a single, continuous intention. What remained uncertain was not whether these elements were connected, but how precisely that connection had been carried out. Attention returned once more to the man himself, though now with a different purpose. His role in the events of that night required closer examination, not only in terms of what he had done, but in how he had been positioned within the structure of the crime. There are individuals who lead, others who follow, and some who are included only for a time, their presence necessary at one stage and inconvenient at another. The distinction, though subtle, often reveals itself in the smallest details. His clothing, while unremarkable at first glance, showed signs of recent exposure to an environment unlike the interior of the train. There was a fine layer of dust along the lower edges, not the soft residue of travel, but something slightly heavier, more consistent with enclosed spaces where materials are stored rather than moved. It was not distributed evenly, suggesting contact rather than prolonged presence, as though he had passed through such a place shortly before his death. This observation aligned with a possibility that had already begun to take form. If the robbery had been carried out with precision, then it was likely that the participants had identified a location in which to divide what had been taken. Such places are rarely chosen at random. They tend to be quiet, removed from immediate attention, and known in advance to those who intend to use them. The presence of dust of that particular kind suggested not the open street, but an interior space long undisturbed by regular activity. Edmund Blackwood allowed this idea to develop without forcing it into conclusion. His approach remained consistent, building not from assumption, but from accumulation. Each detail was considered in relation to the others, forming connections that, while not yet complete, began to suggest direction. The condition of the man's personal effects offered little in terms of identification, yet even this absence carried meaning. There were no documents, no items that might link him directly to a fixed address or known occupation. It was not unusual for those engaged in unlawful activity to travel lightly, but the completeness of this absence suggested intention. He had not merely lost such items, he had not carried them at all. This, in turn, reinforced the idea that the events of the night had been planned with care. The participants had anticipated the need to move quickly, to leave behind as little trace as possible, and to avoid any detail that might lead back to them. Such preparation, while effective in many respects, also revealed something of their expectations. They had not intended to be interrupted. They had not anticipated failure, which made the death of one of their number all the more significant. The absence of visible injury continued to suggest that whatever had ended the man's life had done so without struggle. This did not imply calm, but control. It pointed toward a moment in which resistance had either been prevented or rendered impossible, allowing the act to be carried out without disturbance. The stillness of his posture, the lack of disarray in his clothing, and the absence of marks upon the surrounding surfaces all supported this conclusion. The timing of that moment remained uncertain, though the stopped watch in his pocket, noted during the initial examination, provided a reference that could not be ignored. It had ceased its movement at a point earlier than the arrival of the train, and earlier, too, than the estimated time of the robbery's discovery. Whether this was the result of damage or coincidence was not yet clear, but its position within the sequence of events suggested that it might correspond more closely to the moment of his death than to any later occurrence. If this were so, then the man had died before he had been placed within the compartment. This understanding brought the investigation closer to a coherent structure, yet it also introduced a deeper question. If his companions had intended to remove him from the division of what had been taken, then the decision to do so must have been made at a point when escape was still possible and when the risk of delay could be managed. It suggested not a sudden conflict, but a quiet agreement carried out without warning. Such actions are rarely without indication, though the signs are often overlooked until their consequences become clear. A hesitation, a change in movement, a subtle shift in attention. These are the moments in which intention reveals itself before it is acted upon. Yet no such detail had been recorded in relation to the robbery, leaving only the outcome to be considered. Edmund's attention returned, in time, to the route of the train, and to the narrow section where its movement slowed near the old structure by the tracks. The convergence of location, timing, and obscured visibility now appeared less like coincidence and more like opportunity recognized in advance. It was not merely a place where something could happen unnoticed, but a place where something might have been intended to occur all along. The man had passed through a space filled with dust and silence, had been deprived of movement without leaving a trace of resistance, and had been carried to a point along the railway where the boundary between inside and outside could be crossed without clear observation. From there, the remainder of the act required only precision. And precision, in such matters, is rarely accidental. The growing coherence of the case did not bring with it any sense of finality, but rather a quiet narrowing of focus. What had once appeared as a question without direction had begun to settle into a line of thought that, while still incomplete, moved with a certain internal consistency. The man had not entered the train as a passenger, nor had he died within the compartment. These two conclusions, once uncertain, now formed the foundation upon which the rest of the inquiry continued. It was at this stage that Edmund turned his attention more deliberately toward the physical conditions that would have made such a transfer possible. The section of track previously identified, where the train passed close to the old structure, required closer examination, not as an abstract possibility, but as a precise environment in which each element could be observed and measured against the requirements of the act itself. The building stood as it had for many years, its purpose long diminished, its presence maintained more by neglect than by use. Its walls ran parallel to the track for a short distance, creating a narrow corridor through which the train passed with reduced speed. The proximity was not uniform, and in one particular stretch, the distance between the outer wall and the carriage was sufficiently small to allow for careful interaction, provided the timing was exact. Such a location, when considered in isolation, might have seemed impractical. The movement of the train, even when slowed, would present a considerable challenge to any attempt at contact. Yet when combined with the conditions of that night, the situation changed. The presence of dense fog had reduced visibility to a degree that concealed not only distance, but motion itself. Objects near the train would not appear with clarity, and actions carried out within that obscured space could pass without drawing attention. Edmund Blackwood observed the alignment of the structure with a level of detail that suggested more than casual interest. The height of the windows, the angle of the carriage as it passed, the brief interval during which the speed diminished, all were considered as parts of a single arrangement. It was not enough that the act could be imagined. It had to be possible within the exact conditions that existed at the time. Within this framework, the earlier observation concerning the window frame began to take on a more defined significance. The slight disturbance in the settled dust, though subtle, now suggested contact from the outside rather than from within. It was not a mark left by force, but by proximity, as though something had passed through the narrow boundary without disrupting it entirely. The mechanism of the window itself, while secure when properly fastened, was not beyond manipulation. Older designs, though reliable, often allowed for limited adjustment from the exterior when approached with sufficient knowledge. It would not require strength, only familiarity and precision. A small opening, created briefly and then restored, would leave little to indicate that it had occurred at all. This understanding did not stand alone, but aligned with the broader pattern that had been forming. The man, already dead, had been brought to this point along the track, positioned in advance, and introduced into the compartment at the precise moment when the train's movement allowed for it. The act would have required coordination between at least two individuals, each aware of their role, each prepared to act without hesitation. The absence of witnesses, once a source of confusion, now appeared as a natural consequence of the conditions. The fog concealed form, the movement of the train masked sound, and the expectation of uninterrupted travel discouraged attention. What occurred within that narrow space between structure and carriage did so within a moment already defined by transition. Yet even as this explanation took shape, Edmund did not treat it as complete. He did not assume that possibility alone was sufficient, nor that the alignment of conditions proved intent. Instead, he continued to examine the details, testing whether they remained consistent when viewed from different angles, whether they held under the weight of scrutiny. The position of the body within the compartment supported the idea of careful placement. It had not been left in disorder, nor positioned hastily. The posture suggested intention, as though the final arrangement had been considered in advance. This, in turn, implied that the act of transfer had not been rushed, but executed with a degree of control that allowed for precision even within a limited window of time. Such control required more than opportunity. It required familiarity with the environment, an understanding of the train's movement, and a confidence that the act could be completed without interruption. These were not qualities associated with chance, but with preparation. The case, which had begun as a question of impossibility, now stood as an example of careful design. Each element, when considered in relation to the others, contributed to a sequence that moved from action to concealment with deliberate continuity. The man had been removed from one setting and introduced into another, not as an afterthought, but as part of a plan that accounted for both space and time. And yet, within that plan, there remained one final uncertainty. The method by which he had been placed within the train was now within reach of understanding. The reason for which it had been done, though suggested, had not yet fully revealed itself. The question of motive, though now more defined than before, remained unsettled in its finer details. The removal of the man from the sequence of events suggested intention, yet intention alone does not explain the manner in which it is carried out. There are simpler ways to conceal a death, methods that require less precision and far less risk. The decision to place the body within a moving train, under conditions that demanded careful timing and coordination, implied a purpose beyond mere disposal. It was this distinction that began to guide Edmund's attention toward the broader implications of the act. The placement of the body had not only removed it from its original location, but had introduced it into a context that would inevitably draw inquiry. A sealed compartment, a passenger without a ticket, an arrival without witness, these were not details that would pass unnoticed. They were, in a sense, an invitation to investigation. Such an outcome could not be entirely accidental. The possibility emerged that the act had been designed not only to conceal, but to redirect. By placing the man within the train, those responsible had ensured that attention would be drawn toward the circumstances of his presence rather than the location of his death. The question of how he had arrived would take precedence, occupying the focus of any inquiry and delaying consideration of where the act had truly occurred. This understanding did not resolve the case, but it altered its emphasis. The mystery of the compartment, once central, now appeared as part of a larger design, one that extended beyond the railway and into the earlier events of the night. The robbery, when viewed alongside this possibility, began to reveal a different structure. If 3 individuals had participated, and if one had been removed shortly thereafter, then the division of what had been taken would have been altered in a significant way. The absence of one share increased the value of the remaining portions, providing a clear and immediate incentive. Yet such an incentive, while common, does not account for the level of planning required to carry out the act in the manner observed. This suggested that the decision had not been made in response to opportunity, but had been present from the beginning. The man found within the compartment may never have been intended to leave the arrangement alive. This possibility introduced a quiet severity to the case, one that extended beyond the mechanics of the act itself. It suggested that the structure of the crime had included, from its earliest stages, the removal of one participant by the others. The robbery, then, was not only an act of theft, but the first step in a sequence that would end in deliberate exclusion. Attention returned once more to the location suggested by the dust upon the man's clothing. If the division of the stolen items had taken place within an enclosed space, such as a storage building or warehouse, then it would have provided both the privacy required for such an act and the opportunity to carry it out without interruption. The environment would have been familiar to those who chose it, known in advance, and suited to their purposes. Within such a space, the transition from cooperation to removal could occur without drawing attention. The absence of visible injury suggested that the act had been controlled, perhaps carried out in a manner that did not require force in the usual sense. The stillness of the body, the lack of disturbance, all pointed toward a moment in which resistance had been either prevented or rendered ineffective. The sequence, when considered in this light, began to align with a quiet precision. The robbery provided the setting, the warehouse the location of division, and the railway the means of concealment. Each element supported the others, forming a structure that, while complex, remained consistent in its intention. Edmund Blackwood approached this structure not as a conclusion, but as a working form, one that required confirmation through detail. He did not assume the identity of the location, nor did he fix upon any single interpretation of the events within it. Instead, he allowed the elements to remain flexible, adjusting them as new observations emerged, ensuring that the overall pattern remained intact. What became increasingly clear, however, was that the man's presence within the train had not been the result of improvisation. It had been the final stage of a plan that began well before the robbery itself. His role within that plan had been temporary, defined not by partnership, but by utility. And once that utility had ended, so too had his place within it. The train, with its ordered compartments and predictable movement, had served as the final layer of that design. It provided not only concealment, but misdirection, drawing attention toward a problem that could be observed but not immediately understood. The body had been placed where it would be found. The method had been chosen so that it would be questioned. And in that questioning, time would be gained. Time enough for those responsible to move beyond the reach of immediate suspicion, leaving behind only the appearance of an impossibility and the quiet assumption that the answer lay where the body had been discovered. Yet the case, as it now stood, suggested otherwise. The truth did not reside within the compartment. It remained where the sequence had begun, in a place chosen not for its visibility, but for its absence from it. The direction of the inquiry, now firmly established, led away from the railway and back into the city, toward the kind of places that exist just beyond the ordinary movement of daily life. The presence of dust upon the man's clothing, though subtle, continued to suggest an interior space long removed from regular use, a place where activity was not constant, but deliberate. Such locations, while not uncommon in London, are rarely visible to those who do not seek them, and even more rarely remembered once past. Edmund Blackwood approached this stage of the investigation with the same measured patience that had guided the earlier observations. Rather than selecting a single location and forcing the facts to fit, he allowed the characteristics of the space to define the search. It would be enclosed, quiet, and accessible without drawing attention. It would lie within a distance that allowed for movement between the site of the robbery and the railway within a limited span of time. And it would offer a degree of familiarity to those who had chosen it, suggesting prior knowledge rather than chance discovery. Records of disused storage buildings, warehouses, and small industrial structures began to form a loose map of possibilities, each one considered not in isolation, but in relation to the path that connected the robbery to the railway line. The pattern that emerged was not immediate, but it carried a certain logic. There were only a few locations that satisfied all conditions, and among them, one stood apart by its proximity to both the site of the crime and the section of track where the train slowed near the old structure. The building itself had long since fallen out of regular use. Its exterior bore the marks of time rather than damage, suggesting that it had been left behind rather than abandoned in haste. Its position, slightly removed from the main flow of movement, allowed it to exist without drawing attention, while still remaining accessible to those who knew of its presence. It was the kind of place that could be entered and exited without notice, provided one did not linger unnecessarily. Within such a setting, the events of that night began to take on a clearer form. The robbery, carried out with precision, would have concluded with the removal of selected items, each chosen for value and portability. The participants, moving with purpose, would have made their way to a location prepared in advance, where the division of what had been taken could occur without interruption. The warehouse, quiet and enclosed, provided the necessary conditions for such an act. It was here, most likely, that the sequence altered. The absence of disturbance within the compartment suggested that the man had not been taken by surprise in a public setting, but rather had been rendered unable to resist in a controlled environment. The stillness of his posture, the lack of visible injury, and the completeness of the scene all pointed toward a moment that had been executed with care rather than force. Within the warehouse, removed from observation, such a moment could occur without urgency. The division of the stolen items, once complete, would leave little reason for delay. It was at this point, perhaps, that the decision already formed was carried out, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of the plan. The remaining individuals, now unencumbered, would then proceed to the next stage. The body, no longer an obstacle, became an element to be managed. Its placement within the train, while complex, offered a solution that aligned with their earlier preparation. The route, the timing, and the conditions had all been considered, suggesting that the final act had been anticipated as clearly as the first. Edmund's examination of the warehouse confirmed little in isolation, yet much in combination. The floor bore traces of recent movement, though not enough to identify those responsible. The air carried the same faint quality of dust observed upon the man's clothing, consistent with a space that had been undisturbed for long periods and then briefly occupied. There were no discarded items, no clear signs of conflict, only the subtle indications of presence that fade quickly when not reinforced. It was not evidence in the conventional sense, but it aligned with the structure that had been forming. The location, the timing, and the condition of the body all supported a sequence that moved from action to removal with deliberate continuity. As the elements settled into place, the case began to lose its earlier ambiguity. What had first appeared as a question without answer now revealed itself as a series of choices, each one made with care, each one contributing to a final arrangement designed to obscure its own origin. The man had not vanished after the robbery. He had been brought to a place where his presence could be controlled, his role concluded, and his absence from the division ensured. From there, the remainder of the plan required only execution. And execution, when guided by preparation, rarely leaves behind more than the faintest trace of its passing. The structure of the case, though now largely defined, continued to reveal its finer details with a certain restraint, as though each element required careful attention before it would fully take its place within the whole. The warehouse, the robbery, and the railway formed a coherent sequence, yet within that sequence there remained small inconsistencies, details that did not immediately contradict the emerging explanation, but neither did they settle comfortably within it. It was the matter of timing that first drew renewed consideration. The stopped watch, recovered from the man's pocket, marked a moment that did not align perfectly with the known progression of events. Its hands had ceased earlier than the official discovery of the robbery, and earlier still than the arrival of the train at the final station. Whether damaged during the act or halted by some unrelated cause, it introduced a quiet uncertainty into the otherwise ordered sequence. Edmund did not treat this as a flaw in the developing structure, but as an indication that the structure itself required adjustment. Time, in such matters, is rarely as straightforward as it appears, particularly when events are compressed into a narrow interval. A delay, a pause, or a moment of stillness can shift the apparent order without altering the underlying reality. When considered alongside the earlier observations, the watch suggested that the man's death had occurred not only outside the train, but earlier than had been assumed. This, in turn, implied that the transition from the warehouse to the railway had not been immediate. There had been a period, however brief, in which the body remained unplaced, held in readiness for the next stage of the plan. This interval, though easily overlooked, carried significance. It suggested that the timing of the transfer had been chosen with precision, not simply to coincide with the train's passage, but to align with a specific point along its route. The section of track near the old structure, where speed diminished and visibility was reduced, would not present the same conditions at every moment. The exact alignment of movement, position, and obscured sight would occur only within a narrow window. Such precision required patience. The individuals responsible would have needed to wait, holding their position until the train approached, ensuring that the act could be carried out without interruption. This introduced a further element to the case, one that spoke not only of planning, but of discipline. The act had not been rushed, nor had it been left to chance. It had been executed at the moment when all conditions aligned. The physical details of the compartment continued to support this understanding. The absence of disturbance, the controlled posture of the body, and the lack of visible trace all suggested that the transfer had been completed with care. There was no indication of impact, no sign that the body had been forced into position. Instead, it appeared as though it had been placed deliberately, adjusted to match the stillness of the surrounding space. This level of control, when combined with the earlier observations, pointed toward a method that relied not on strength, but on coordination. Two individuals, working together, could achieve what one alone could not. One to manage the body, the other to secure the opening and ensure that the compartment remained undisturbed. The act, though brief, would require both precision and familiarity with the structure of the carriage. Edmund Blackwood considered these elements without haste, allowing them to settle into relation with one another. His method did not seek to confirm a theory through isolated detail, but to observe whether each part remained consistent when viewed as a whole. In this case, the alignment held. The watch, once a point of uncertainty, now reinforced the sequence. It marked not the moment of discovery, but the moment of death, placing that event firmly within the earlier stage of the plan. The interval that followed, though unseen, became an essential part of the process, allowing for the careful positioning required for the final act. As the investigation progressed, the case began to lose the last of its apparent contradictions. What had seemed, at first, to exist outside reason now revealed itself as an example of careful timing, controlled movement, and deliberate design. Each detail, when considered in isolation, might have appeared insignificant. Together, they formed a structure that, while complex, remained entirely within the bounds of possibility. Yet even as this structure approached completion, one element remained beyond immediate reach. The individuals responsible had acted with precision, had moved without leaving clear trace, and had chosen their method with care. Their actions suggested familiarity not only with the environment, but with one another. Such coordination rarely exists without prior association, and prior association, in time, leaves its own form of evidence. The case no longer required an explanation of how the act had been carried out. It required the identification of those who had carried it out. And somewhere within the sequence already uncovered, there remained a detail that would lead directly to them, waiting not to be discovered, but to be recognized. By this stage, the case had shifted from uncertainty to structure, and from structure to something approaching quiet certainty. The sequence of events, once fragmented, now aligned with a consistency that left little room for coincidence. The man had taken part in the robbery, had been removed shortly after, and had been placed within the train under conditions that concealed both his death and its origin. What remained was no longer the question of how, but of who. Edmund Blackwood did not pursue this final stage with haste. His method, as always, relied not on forceful inquiry, but on careful observation of what had already been revealed. The answer, he seemed to understand, would not come from introducing new elements, but from recognizing the significance of those already present. The robbery itself provided the first direction. Though carried out with precision, it had not been without trace. The selection of items, the manner in which the cases had been opened, and the restraint shown in what had been taken all suggested a familiarity with the establishment that went beyond casual knowledge. This was not the work of those who had chosen their target at random, but of individuals who had understood its structure in advance. Such understanding is rarely acquired in isolation. Attention turned to those who had access, not only to the shop itself, but to the routines that governed it. Employees, former employees, delivery agents, and others whose presence might pass without remark were considered, not as suspects in the usual sense, but as sources of connection. Among these, a pattern began to emerge, not in the form of direct evidence, but through absence. Two names, once present in the records, no longer appeared where they should have. Their duties had been reassigned, their presence explained in vague terms, and their movements accounted for only in the most general way. Nothing about this would have drawn notice under ordinary circumstances, yet within the structure of the case, it held a quiet significance. The individuals in question had, at one time, been employed in roles that granted them access to both the interior of the shop and the handling of valuable items. Their knowledge would have extended beyond what was visible to the public, including the placement of secured cases and the timing of deliveries. Such familiarity aligned closely with the precision observed in the robbery. More notably, their connection to one another could not be dismissed as incidental. They had worked within the same environment, had shared responsibilities, and had been present during the same intervals of time. This association, while not uncommon in itself, took on greater meaning when considered alongside their simultaneous absence. Edmund did not treat this as confirmation, but as direction. The route of the train, the location of the warehouse, and the position of the old structure along the track all fell within a range that could be reached without difficulty by those familiar with the city's lesser-used paths. Movement between these points required knowledge, but not exceptional skill. It was the kind of movement that could be planned in advance and executed without attracting attention. The final detail, though small, proved to be of particular importance. Within the compartment, near the lower edge of the window frame, the earlier disturbance in the settled dust had remained largely unchanged. It had not been examined in isolation, nor had it been dismissed. Instead, it had been held in consideration, its significance deferred until the surrounding structure could support it. Now, viewed in relation to the identified individuals, it suggested something more precise. A faint marking, barely visible, indicated contact not with the hand, but with an object. Its shape, though incomplete, suggested a narrow, curved surface, consistent with a tool designed to extend reach or apply controlled pressure. Such an instrument would not be unusual for those accustomed to handling secured cases or working within confined spaces. It was not proof in itself, yet it aligned with the broader pattern. The individuals had the knowledge required for the robbery, the access needed to carry it out, and the familiarity with tools that could facilitate the method observed. Their absence, following the event, provided the final element, suggesting not only involvement, but departure. The case, which had begun with a question of presence, now approached its conclusion through absence once more. The man found within the compartment had been identified not only by his role, but by his removal. The remaining two, though unseen, had left behind a structure that reflected their actions with quiet precision. And within that structure, every detail, from the dust upon the floor to the narrowing of the track, pointed not outward, but back toward them, forming a path that, once followed, would lead directly to the source of the design. The mystery of the compartment had been resolved. What remained was to step beyond it and bring into view those who had ensured that it would exist at all. With the structure of the case now firmly in place, the search for the remaining two individuals no longer depended on speculation, but on alignment. Their knowledge of the jeweler's shop, their familiarity with one another, and their apparent understanding of the railway's conditions all suggested a level of experience that could not easily be concealed. Such individuals do not vanish without leaving some trace, even if that trace is subtle. Edmund Blackwood approached this final stage not by pursuing them directly, but by observing the spaces through which they would have moved. Those who act with precision often rely on routes that offer both efficiency and discretion, favoring paths that avoid unnecessary attention while remaining within reach of their objective. In a city such as London, these paths are numerous, yet not without pattern. The area surrounding the warehouse provided the first indication. Though the building itself had been left largely undisturbed, the streets beyond it bore signs of recent passage. Not the clear imprint of hurried escape, but the faint suggestion of movement carried out with purpose. A carriage track, partially preserved in the soft surface of the road, extended toward a narrower street that connected, in time, to a larger thoroughfare leading away from the railway. This direction did not point toward concealment, but toward departure. The timing of events suggested that the individuals had not remained in the vicinity after placing the body within the train. The interval between the act and the discovery, though limited, would have been sufficient to create distance, provided they moved without delay. The absence of any further disturbance within the area supported this, indicating that their actions had been confined to a brief and controlled period. Further consideration of their previous employment revealed an additional detail. Their duties within the jeweler's establishment had included not only access to valuable items, but also familiarity with the processes by which such items were transported and recorded. This knowledge would have extended beyond the shop itself, encompassing the routes by which goods entered and left the district, and the means by which such movement could be concealed within ordinary activity. It was within this understanding that Edmund found the final point of connection. A shipment, scheduled shortly after the night of the robbery, had been recorded as delayed, though no clear reason had been given. The delay, while minor, had altered the expected flow of goods, creating a brief irregularity within an otherwise consistent system. Such irregularities, though often dismissed, can serve as indicators of intentional interference, particularly when they coincide with other events of significance. The route of that shipment led away from the city, following a line that extended beyond the immediate reach of local inquiry. It was not a path chosen at random, but one that aligned with established patterns of movement, offering both distance and the appearance of legitimacy. Edmund did not treat this as coincidence. The individuals, having removed their companion and concealed the origin of his death, required a means of departure that would not draw attention. A scheduled shipment, already accounted for within official records, provided such an opportunity. By aligning their movement with it, they could extend their distance from the city without introducing any new irregularities beyond those already present. The precision of this final stage reflected the same careful planning observed throughout the case. Each action had been considered not only in isolation, but in relation to what would follow, ensuring that no single element would stand apart in a way that might invite immediate scrutiny. The man found within the compartment had served his role within this structure, though not in the manner he might have expected. His presence within the train had drawn attention inward, toward a problem that required time to resolve. That time had allowed the others to move outward, beyond the immediate reach of inquiry, carrying with them the result of their work. As the final pieces settled into place, the case revealed itself not as a series of disconnected events, but as a continuous design, each part dependent upon the others, each contributing to a single, unified outcome. The mystery had not been created by chance. It had been constructed, and now, with its structure understood, it no longer concealed the truth, but pointed directly toward it, extending beyond the boundaries of the compartment, beyond the railway, and into the path taken by those who had ensured that it would remain, for a time, unresolved. By the time the final connections began to settle into place, the case no longer relied on speculation, but on a structure that had revealed itself through careful observation. Each element, once uncertain, now aligned with a precision that suggested not only intention, but foresight. The robbery, the warehouse, the railway, and the subsequent disappearance of the two remaining individuals all formed a sequence that moved without contradiction from one stage to the next. Yet Edmund Blackwood did not treat this alignment as a conclusion in itself. Instead, he returned once more to the earlier details, not to question them, but to confirm that they remained consistent when viewed in light of what had now been understood. It was his habit to revisit the beginning once the end had come into view, ensuring that no part of the structure rested on assumption alone. The compartment, in particular, required this renewed attention. What had once appeared as an isolated mystery now stood as the final expression of the entire design. The position of the body, the absence of disturbance, and the secured window were no longer questions without answer, but results of deliberate action. Each detail, when reconsidered, revealed a consistency that could not be attributed to chance. The posture of the man, composed and undisturbed, suggested that his placement had been carried out with care, not only to conceal the act itself, but to shape the appearance of the scene that would later be discovered. The absence of visible injury had ensured that immediate conclusions could not be drawn, while the lack of disorder prevented any simple explanation based on struggle or intrusion. Even the smallest elements now held significance. The faint disturbance near the window frame, once uncertain, now aligned precisely with the method by which the body had been introduced. The settled dust, preserved across most surfaces, confirmed that the compartment had remained unused throughout the journey, reinforcing the conclusion that the man had not been present until the moment of transfer. Edmund moved through these observations without haste, as though confirming not only their accuracy, but their necessity. Nothing had been left to chance, and nothing had been included without purpose. The act had been designed to withstand initial examination, to present a question that could not be answered without time, and in doing so, to delay the recognition of its true origin. The broader structure of the case supported this understanding. The warehouse had provided the setting for the division of the stolen items and the removal of the third participant. Its condition, though lacking in direct evidence, aligned with the physical traces observed upon the man's clothing, confirming its role within the sequence. The route from that location to the railway had been chosen with equal care, ensuring that the transition from one stage to the next could be completed without interruption. The section of track near the old structure, where the train's movement slowed and visibility diminished, had served as the point of transfer. Its selection reflected not only an awareness of the railway's operation, but a precise understanding of how its ordinary function could be used to conceal extraordinary action. The fog, the reduced speed, and the narrow distance between wall and carriage had combined to create a moment in which the boundary between outside and inside could be crossed without detection. The subsequent departure of the remaining individuals, aligned with the delayed shipment, completed the sequence. Their movement away from the city had been integrated into an existing system, allowing them to extend their distance without introducing new irregularities that might attract attention. It was a continuation of the same principle that had governed the earlier stages of the plan, to remain within expectation while acting beyond it. As these elements were considered together, the case revealed itself in full. It had not been a matter of isolated actions, but of a continuous design in which each stage prepared the conditions for the next. The robbery had created the opportunity, the warehouse had provided the setting, the railway had offered concealment, and the final departure had ensured that the result would remain unresolved long enough to allow escape. Edmund Blackwood regarded this structure with the same quiet attention that had guided the investigation from the beginning. There was no sense of triumph in his manner, nor any indication that the conclusion brought satisfaction. Instead, there was only a recognition of completeness, a sense that the elements, once scattered, had now found their proper relation. For my part, the clarity of the sequence brought with it a different impression. What had first appeared as an impossible event had resolved into something far more deliberate, a demonstration of how carefully arranged actions can create the illusion of mystery. The man in the compartment had not been an anomaly, but the final component of a plan designed to obscure its own origin. And in that realization, the case revealed its true nature. It had never been about the impossibility of presence. It had been about the certainty of design, carried out with such precision that, for a time, it appeared to defy explanation. Yet now, with each detail returned to its place, that illusion had faded, leaving behind only the quiet understanding of how it had been achieved and why. With the full structure of the case now visible, what remained was not the discovery of new elements, but the confirmation of those already understood. The identity of the two remaining individuals, once uncertain, had begun to settle into place through the alignment of their absence, their prior access to the jeweler's establishment, and their familiarity with one another. These were not isolated indicators, but parts of a pattern that, when viewed together, left little room for doubt. Edmund Blackwood approached this final stage with the same measured precision that had guided every step before it. He did not rely on accusation, nor did he seek to force a conclusion where the evidence did not fully support it. Instead, he allowed the pattern to resolve naturally, ensuring that each detail could stand independently while still contributing to the whole. The records of employment, though incomplete, confirmed that both individuals had left their positions under circumstances that, while not openly suspicious, lacked clear explanation. Their departure, occurring shortly before the events of the robbery, suggested preparation rather than coincidence. It allowed them to remove themselves from immediate association with the establishment while retaining the knowledge necessary to carry out the act. Further inquiry into their movements revealed that they had not remained within their usual places of residence. Their absence, noted but not immediately questioned, aligned with the timing of the delayed shipment that had been identified earlier. This connection, though indirect, provided a path by which their departure from the city could be understood, not as flight, but as continuation. The alignment of these elements brought the case to a point where the conclusion no longer depended on speculation. The robbery, the removal of their companion, the placement of the body within the train, and their subsequent departure all formed a sequence that reflected both intention and execution. There was no single moment that defined their actions, but rather a series of decisions, each one reinforcing the next. What remained, however, was the recognition of how narrowly the plan had depended upon precision. The section of track chosen for the transfer allowed for only a brief interval in which the act could be completed without disruption. The fog, though present, could not be guaranteed in advance, and its density would vary across even short distances. The mechanism of the window, while accessible, required knowledge that could not be improvised in the moment. Each of these factors introduced a degree of uncertainty that could not be entirely controlled. And yet, the plan had succeeded. This success did not diminish the risk involved, but it demonstrated a level of confidence that suggested familiarity not only with the environment, but with the process itself. The individuals responsible had not acted as though they were attempting something new. Their movements, as reconstructed through the sequence of events, reflected a certainty that comes only from prior understanding. Whether this understanding had been gained through observation, experience, or some earlier, unrecorded attempt remained unclear. What mattered was that it had been sufficient to guide them through each stage without hesitation, allowing them to carry out an act that, at first glance, appeared beyond explanation. Edmund Blackwood did not dwell on this aspect of the case, yet it remained present in the quiet completeness of his conclusions. The design had been precise, but not flawless. It had relied upon conditions that, while favorable, could not be entirely controlled, and upon a sequence that required each stage to proceed without interruption. That it had done so spoke not only to the planning involved, but to the absence of interference. No witness had observed the transfer, no interruption had occurred within the warehouse, and no delay had prevented their departure. Each stage had unfolded as intended, allowing the plan to reach its conclusion without deviation. As I considered this, it became clear that the case, while resolved in its structure, carried with it a subtle reflection of chance. Not in the sense that the events themselves had been accidental, but in the sense that their success had depended, in part, upon conditions beyond the control of those who had set them in motion. The man found within the compartment had been the result of deliberate action, yet the absence of disruption that allowed that action to succeed had not been guaranteed. It was this balance between design and circumstance that gave the case its final character. The truth had not been hidden by impossibility, but by precision supported, for a brief moment, by silence. As the investigation approached its final stage, there was a noticeable shift in its character. The earlier sense of uncertainty, shaped by absence and contradiction, had given way to a quiet completeness in which each element supported the others. What remained was not the discovery of new facts, but the careful bringing together of those already established, ensuring that the entire sequence could be understood without reliance on assumption. Edmund Blackwood did not treat this moment as an ending in the conventional sense. His method, consistent from the beginning, required that the structure of the case be examined once more in its entirety, not to challenge its conclusions, but to confirm that nothing within it stood apart. Each detail, no matter how small, had to find its place within the whole, contributing not only to explanation, but to coherence. The robbery, when viewed in isolation, had been executed with a level of precision that suggested preparation beyond the immediate objective. The selection of items, the restraint shown in their removal, and the absence of unnecessary disturbance all pointed toward individuals who understood not only what they sought, but how best to obtain it without drawing attention. This understanding extended beyond the act itself, shaping the events that followed. The warehouse, identified through the traces left upon the man's clothing and the alignment of location, had provided the setting for the transition from cooperation to removal. Within its enclosed space, the division of the stolen items had likely taken place, followed by the act that ended the involvement of the third participant. The lack of visible injury and the controlled condition of the body suggested that this act had been carried out with deliberation, minimizing resistance and preserving the order required for what would come next. From this point, the sequence moved toward the railway, where the final stage of the plan would be executed. The selection of the section of track near the old structure was not incidental. Its proximity to the carriage, combined with the reduced speed of the train and the obscuring effect of the fog, created a narrow window of opportunity in which the boundary between exterior and interior could be crossed without detection. This was not a matter of chance, but of precise alignment, requiring both knowledge and timing. The act itself, as it now stood understood, had been carried out with a degree of coordination that left little room for error. The body, already prepared, had been introduced through the window, positioned within the compartment in such a way that it appeared undisturbed, as though it had been present throughout the journey. The window, manipulated from the outside and then restored, left only the faintest indication of contact, a detail so subtle that it might have gone entirely unnoticed without careful observation. This final arrangement served a purpose beyond concealment. It transformed the body into a question, one that would draw attention toward the compartment and away from the earlier stages of the sequence. The impossibility of the man's presence, reinforced by the absence of witnesses and the secured window, created a problem that required time to resolve, ensuring that the origin of the act would remain obscured long enough for those responsible to move beyond immediate reach. The subsequent departure of the two individuals, aligned with the delayed shipment, completed the design. Their movement away from the city had been integrated into an existing system, allowing them to extend their distance without introducing new irregularities. It was the final expression of the same principle that had governed the entire sequence, to act within expectation while remaining beyond detection. Edmund Blackwood regarded this completed structure with a quiet certainty. There was no need for further adjustment, no detail that required reconsideration. The case had resolved itself not through sudden revelation, but through the gradual alignment of facts, each one contributing to a pattern that, once fully formed, left no element unexplained. For myself, the clarity of this conclusion carried a different weight. The mystery that had first drawn attention had not been one of impossibility, but of perception. The mind, confronted with a scene that defied immediate understanding, had sought explanation within the confines of what was visible, overlooking the broader sequence that lay beyond it. Only by stepping back, by allowing each detail to find its place within a larger structure, had the true nature of the case been revealed. The man in the compartment had not been an anomaly nor a coincidence. He had been the final piece of a design that began long before the train had reached its destination. His presence, carefully arranged, had served to conceal the path that led to it, transforming a deliberate act into a question without an immediate answer. Now, with that path restored, the case no longer held its earlier ambiguity. It stood as a complete and ordered sequence, each stage connected to the next, each action guided by intention rather than chance. And in that order, the mystery dissolved, leaving behind only the understanding of how it had been constructed and why. The compartment, once the center of the inquiry, was no longer a place of uncertainty, but a point within a larger design, its silence no longer concealing, but revealing the precision with which the entire sequence had been carried out. By the time the case reached its quiet conclusion, there was little left that required resolution in the conventional sense. The sequence had revealed itself fully, each part aligned with the next in a manner that left no detail without place. What had begun as a question shaped by absence had become an answer defined by structure, and within that structure, the mystery had dissolved into understanding. Edmund Blackwood did not mark this conclusion with any outward change in manner. As with all his cases, there was no moment of declaration, no single point at which the matter was considered finished. Instead, there was only a gradual withdrawal of attention, a recognition that the elements no longer required arrangement, and that the pattern, once incomplete, now stood on its own. The man found within the train remained where he had been discovered, though his presence no longer carried the same uncertainty. He was no longer an anomaly within a sealed compartment, but the final expression of a deliberate design. His role, though never intended to extend beyond a single night, had shaped the course of the investigation, drawing attention inward before allowing it, slowly, to return outward to its source. The two who had ensured this outcome had moved beyond immediate reach, their departure aligned with the same precision that had guided their earlier actions. Whether they would, in time, be found was a matter that lay beyond the scope of the case as it had presented itself. What remained certain was that their plan, though carefully constructed, had not remained beyond understanding. As I reflected upon the sequence, there was a sense that the case had revealed more than the actions of those involved. It had illustrated, with quiet clarity, the manner in which perception can be guided, how attention can be drawn toward one point while the truth resides elsewhere. The compartment, with its stillness and apparent impossibility, had served not as the origin of the mystery, but as its final concealment. It is often assumed that complexity lies in the creation of intricate designs, yet this case suggested otherwise. Its strength had been in simplicity, in the careful alignment of ordinary elements. A train, a window, a moment of reduced speed, arranged in such a way that they produced an effect far greater than the sum of their parts. Nothing within it had been beyond reason, and yet, when first encountered, it had appeared so. That distinction between what is and what is perceived lingered long after the details had settled. Edmund, or Blackwood as he was more often known in the accounts that would later circulate, did not dwell on such reflections. His attention had already moved beyond the case, not in dismissal, but in accordance with his nature, which allowed little space for what had already been resolved. The work, for him, existed only in the moment of its unfolding, and once complete, it required no further consideration. For myself, the act of recording what had occurred carried a different purpose. It was not merely to preserve the sequence of events, but to capture the manner in which they had been understood, to ensure that the quiet logic behind them remained visible even as time passed. Cases such as this do not rely on spectacle, but on attention, and it is through attention that they are both created and resolved. The train, long since returned to its ordinary routine, no longer bore any sign of what had taken place within it. Its compartments would be occupied once more by travelers unaware of the brief moment in which one of them had carried a question that could not immediately be answered. The window, the seat, the narrow space that had held such significance, had returned to their usual function, indistinguishable from any other. And yet, for those who knew where to look, the pattern remained. Not in the carriage, nor in the station, but in the understanding that had been drawn from them. The man had not appeared without cause, nor had the circumstances of his discovery defied reason. They had followed a path, carefully arranged, that led from intention to execution with quiet precision. The case, in the end, had not been about the mystery of a presence within a sealed space. It had been about the certainty of how that presence had come to be. And in that certainty, the question that had first given rise to it found its answer, not in revelation, but in the patient recognition of what had always been there. If this account has held your attention, you may find others of a similar nature worth your time. There are many such cases, each carrying its own quiet logic, each waiting to be understood. And should you choose to remain a little longer, there will always be another story to follow, another pattern to observe, and another moment in which the ordinary reveals something just beyond expectation.